Cal Harlan stood on the porch rail of the Dry Creek General Store on an August evening in 1874, hat tipped back, one boot heel striking the plank in a rhythm that kept the crowd laughing, while Wayne West drove another iron staple through a sod block across the street. Silas Redd leaned in the doorway beside him, clean vest, clean cuffs, freight ledger under one arm, and he gave the laughter its permission by besmiling at the right moments and saying nothing until the crowd wanted a line worth repeating. Cal called across the road, loud enough for every soul within 2 blocks. Miss West is building herself a hill to hide in. Perhaps she intends to winter like a badger. The men at the hitching rail laughed first, the boys by the water barrel next, and then the wives who had paused with flour sacks against their hips laughed because silence would have placed them against the town's most confident men. Wayne set the hammer down, straightened, and brushed clay from her palms without looking toward the porch. Silas finally spoke, voice warm enough to sound polite, sharp enough to carry contempt. You have purchased 2,400 board feet of pine to bury half of it under dirt. You have spent a summer on one room no family can host guests in. Dry Creek has 327 souls, Miss West, and none of us has required a bunker to survive. Cal lifted both hands and shouted, "She came 286 miles to teach us weather." Laughter spilled again, wider and crueler, and Eli West stood at the corner post of the freight office with his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to cross the street to his sister in front of witnesses who paid his debt. Wayne crossed back to her wall, took up her hammer, and set one more staple in place while every laugh still hung in the air. Her answer came in a plain voice that did not rise to meet theirs. "When the north wind arrives, this room will hold heat for children and old men alike. Any door I own will open." She gave no second sentence, and the town mistook restraint for defeat. That misreading settled over Dry Creek like dust and became the shape of the months that followed, because by the next market day, families that had quietly discussed pooled fuel and shared cellars withdrew those plans rather than risk becoming porch entertainment themselves. 2 years earlier, in 1872, Eli West had ridden out of Abilene with a hide crew headed south and west. He left a folded note at their aunt's table, saying he would return before first snow with wages enough to buy his own team. Winter came, then spring, then another winter. No letter arrived. Freight men carried rumors through cattle towns, and none matched another closely enough to trust. One said he had gone to Mexico. One said he was buried near the Canadian River. One said he had signed on with a trader under another name. The family had no institution to appeal to, and no registry of labor contracts across the plains. They had only names, distance, and time. Wayne waited through 1873 for a trace she could verify. In February of 1874, a mule driver out of Fort Cobb sold a bundle of old freight receipts in Abilene for tobacco money, and one scrap carried a penciled wagon tally with Eli's hand on the last line, an E shaped in his older style from school copybooks. The receipt named Dry Creek Station. That mark resolved her first obstacle in one stroke, because before she saw it she had no fixed place to search, and once she had it she could ride to a town instead of chasing stories. She sold a silver-backed saddle plate, drew her travel cash to $198, packed tools instead of dresses, and left in March. The ride covered 286 miles over mixed spring ground, where thaw and hardpan traded places by the hour. She crossed creeks with ice still under the banks and took 2 nights in line shacks where teamsters slept in shifts with one fire for 6 men. The horse she rode, a rangy bay mare named Lark, had pulled freight in Kansas before Wayne bought her, and Wayne spoke to her as a working partner because every mile depended on how that mare placed her feet in bad ground. They reached Dry Creek under a sky the color of tin, with wagon ruts frozen into ridges and a wind that carried alkali from the flats east of town. Dry Creek Station sat where two wagon roads met a short spur track that failed as often as it ran. The town had been settled for 11 years, long enough to produce a hierarchy and short enough to keep every hierarchy brittle. Silas Red controlled cattle contracts and freight sheds at the north edge. Nina Red kept the storebooks and the private notes that never reached open ledgers. Reverend Amos Pike held the church platform and the language of certainty in public meetings. Cal Harlan owned the livery and had converted mockery into a social profession. Deputy Tom Bell held legal authority that remained narrow, practical, and local, since distant territorial offices sent rules slower than storms. Wayne found Eli inside Silas's freight yard on her second morning in town, shoulders bent over a broken axle, beard grown uneven, left hand wrapped in leather where a spoke had split skin the week before. He recognized her at once and looked first toward Silas's office before he looked back to her face. That movement exposed his condition before he spoke a word. He had not stayed away from shame alone. He had stayed because his labor had already been sold forward. Silas joined them with a ledger under his arm and explained the arrangement in tones used for account disputes. Eli had taken advances over 2 seasons, first for ammunition and hides, later for mules lost in a river crossing. The open balance stood at $312, secured by labor under freight contracts that rolled month to month. Eli could leave if the debt cleared. Until then, each missed day added penalties in board and replacement wages. Wayne asked to inspect the entries. Silas showed her the pages with theatrical patience while 3 teamsters watched from the gate. Numbers remained plain and legal in form. The leverage lay in who controlled work at Dry Creek, and that leverage meant Wayne could not take Eli home immediately. She had to remain in town through the warm months and build, while Eli worked the balance down. That evening, Wayne and Eli sat behind the livery with a coffee pot, between them and the smell of horse sweat in the boards. Eli gave the first honest account since he disappeared. He had expected 1 profitable season in buffalo hides. Then 1 bad year had pushed him into advances, and each advance had purchased 1 more month of servitude. He had hidden the debt from home because confession would have sent help he did not believe the family could afford. His obstacle had been shame. Once he admitted the $312 openly, planning became possible, because secrecy had blocked any joint action, and admission gave Wayne something concrete to solve. Wayne had not ridden south with only debt in mind. She had carried weather knowledge learned north of the Platte, where she had wintered as a widow among sod houses that survived when framed homes froze. Her late husband had died in a blizzard in 1869 after choosing speed over shelter on an exposed trail. His death had taught no mystical lesson, only a measurable one. Open wall surface bled heat faster than frontier stoves could replace it when wind drove cold through every seam. Earth held temperature if walls were thick, roof lines low, and doorways baffled. She told Eli she would pay what debt she could, work the balance down, and build for a cold event Dry Creek had never prepared for. Nina Red became the quiet hinge of that early period. She met Wayne at the store counter while Silas inspected cattle papers outside and let Wayne see duplicate freight slips not entered in public totals. Eli's penalties had been legal in line items, inflated in timing. Nina did not denounce her husband. She wrote figures in pencil and slid the paper across the counter. She gave Wayne enough accounting clarity to target repayment rather than argue each charge blindly. Before Nina's intervention, Wayne could not separate principal from rotating fees. Afterward, she could map which weeks of labor would lower the balance fastest. Wayne put $186 of her $198 cash into materials within 3 weeks, keeping $12 for lamp oil, salt, and horseshoeing emergencies. She bought 2,400 board feet of pine from a rail consignment at inflated spring prices, then hired 2 boys by the day to cut sod blocks where creek banks held dense grass roots. The build site sat on a slight rise west of town where floodwater had never reached, with a shallow draw to the north that could channel wind away from a recessed entry. Eli worked nights after freight shifts to avoid Silas claiming his labor hours, and Tabea Nevaquaya walked the site twice each week to test soil moisture and drainage by touch and spade. Tabea lived near Raincrow Creek, a day ride east, in a cedar and earth lodge with a medicine garden fenced against deer. Traders called her Comanche, though her kin network crossed multiple bands and interpreters along the borderlands, once named Comancheria. By 1874, officials used new territorial terms, yet frontier speech still called the region Comanche territory, and the phrase carried habit more than precision. Tabea translated for traveling families, treated fevers with willow and yarrow when doctors were weeks away, and read plane signals with severe accuracy. She did not flatter Wayne. She corrected measurements and asked for reason before she accepted any claim. Wayne's storm house rose in methodical stages from May through August. She set an 18 by 32-foot interior rectangle over a shallow trench foundation lined with stone scavenged from the creek cut. Exterior walls combined timber framing with packed sod to a full 24 inches of thickness. Then she bermed earth against 3 sides up to window sill height, so only the south face stood mostly exposed. The roof carried a tight pitch with double planking, tarred canvas under shingles and weighted edge logs to resist uplift. Entry came through an offset passage that turned twice before reaching the main room, so wind lost force before it reached the stove. She dug the root cellar 11 feet deep with Eli and 1 hired laborer, shoring the shaft in green oak and lining shelves with cedar boards to discourage rot and mice. A vent pipe angled north and another south to regulate damp and stale air. Beside the cellar, she cut a fuel trench and roofed it low to keep wood dry under sleet. By the first week of September, 9 cords of fuel wood stood stacked and covered in alternating layers for fast access in high wind. She stored 640 pounds of dried meat in cloth-wrapped racks, 22 bushels of beans in sealed bins, and 14 water casks filled and capped with waxed cloth over bung holes. Cal Harlan converted her progress into public sport as each stage made retreat less possible. He began with jokes near the hitch rail, moved to naming her place Mole House in front of customers, and reached his sharpest line during a Saturday crowd when he told a wagon crew she was packing food for ghosts she plans to invent by winter. That escalation removed social ambiguity for every bystander. Before those scenes, some neighbors had remained undecided and private. After repeated ridicule from a central town figure, silence became assent, and mockery hardened into policy by habit, with councilmen citing porch laughter as proof that communal stockpiling was panic rather than prudence. Silas watched this process and made one practical move that raised stakes beyond insult. He instructed his yard foreman to prioritize freight clients over private buyers for stovepipe and iron fittings, which delayed Wayne's delivery by 9 days in late June. She answered by salvaging pipe from 2 abandoned cook wagons and reshaping joints with Eli at night. The obstacle had been material access under monopolized supply. Her workaround kept the build schedule intact, and the sight of repurposed pipe carrying clean draft later in October would carry moral weight no speech could match. Deputy Tom Bell remained cautious through summer and did not align publicly with either side. He inspected Wayne's site after a complaint claimed she had dug an unsafe pit near the road. He measured setback from the wagon track, found no violation by local custom, and filed no order. His restraint mattered. Before that inspection, Cal had expected legal pressure to halt construction. After Bell declined to intervene, The only remaining opposition was social and economic, not procedural. Bell saw more than he said, and his habit of writing details in a pocket notebook would later support new ordinances when memory turned selective. Reverend Amos Pike gave the summer's most damaging sermon in July. He stood in the church with windows open to heat and declared that fear multiplied hardship by persuading families to hoard against neighbors. He named no person, though every soul recognized the target. He called extraordinary preparation a temptation toward mistrust and told fathers that panic entered homes through unusual practices imported from elsewhere. The line landed because Amos held moral authority among women who managed household stores. After that Sunday, 3 families who had planned small extra purchases canceled their orders at the store and returned to ordinary stock levels. Wayne did not counter from the church steps. She kept working in the open where measurements could answer accusation. She recorded each quantity in a notebook Nina had stitched from spare ledger paper, and Nina copied those entries at month's end into the store's back book under household supplies. This small accounting partnership created future evidence. Before they began those duplicate records, critics could call Wayne's claim preparations exaggerated after the fact. Once entries existed in 2 independent books, denial had less room. Documentation became a quiet defense, prepared before any trial arrived. In early September, Tabia rode in from Raincrow Creek with signs that narrowed forecast uncertainty. Antelope herds had shifted routes earlier than usual and crossed shallow draws in tight groups, behavior her elders associated with abrupt northern pressure drops. She had watched evening clouds flatten into long iron sheets and felt warm ground wind replaced by high, dry pulses from the northwest before dawn. Wayne compared those signs with her own notes on barometric discomfort in joints, dust taste, and late insect silence. Their agreement resolved doubt enough to force a final public warning, and Wayne asked Tabia to stand in the hall and attest that the signs were observed, repeatable, and already underway. Wayne requested floor time at the September town council meeting held in the freight hall. Silas chaired, Reverend Amos prayed. Cal sat on a grain sack near the door, and 40 souls crowded benches while others stood at windows. Wayne proposed communal stockpiling in one shared cellar, rotation of fuel teams, and temporary use of her stormhouse as central warming station if a blue norther struck. She listed quantities needed per family and estimated labor by day. Then Tabia confirmed the antelope shift and wean pattern in direct terms. The obstacle was civic authority. She had private preparation already, but broad survival required collective action from those who controlled stores and teams. Silas thanked her for concern and rejected the motion on economic grounds. He said stockpiling would tie up goods needed for profitable autumn trade and spread fear that could depress cattle contracts. Reverend Amos added that extraordinary measures would damage communal trust. Cal asked loudly whether Dry Creek should hold a vote every time a traveler disliked local weather, then repeated his porch line about wintering like badgers until the hall laughed and closed ranks. Laughter followed, less hearty than in August, yet enough to close debate. The refusal resolved civic hope in the negative, and from that night, private preparation became the only path left open. After the meeting, Wayne returned to her site in moonlight, checked each cask seal by touch, and stood beside Lark at the hitch post, while Eli loaded final wood into the trench. She spoke softly where only horse and brother could hear, promising that if her forecast proved true, no soul would be turned from her door, including those who had spent summer naming her a fool. That private vow resolved the story's deepest temptation. Before the test arrived, she removed revenge as an option in advance, which meant later generosity would be policy, not mood. October opened clear and deceptive. On the morning of October 9th, 1874, the sun rose warm enough for shirt sleeves. and men in the yard joked about missed rain while flies still rode horse flanks. By late afternoon, the western horizon turned hard, blue-gray in a straight advancing line that flattened distance and erased color from the grass. Wind shifted north in one sharp swing and took heat from open skin within minutes. Sleet began before full dark, first as scattered needles, then as driven sheets that rattled windows and found every seam in standard frame walls. Dry Creek entered the storm with confidence built on ordinary winters, and ordinary provisions failed by midnight. Stovepipes in tall houses drew backward under gust pressure, filling rooms with smoke. Shingle roofs lifted along weak nails, doors facing north jammed with ice. Families moved mattresses near stoves and discovered that large parlors could not hold heat once wind drove through uninsulated plank walls. Cal Harlan tried to stable extra horses inside his livery barn to save stock for spring, and weight from wet sleet loaded the south span, while men fought doors frozen to the sill. Before dawn on October 10th, Cal climbed a loft ladder to cut a jammed rope line and free a beam for support. The roof gave first at the center joint, then cascaded across stalls in a single heavy drop. 2 men were dragged clear by harness straps. Cal was pinned under the main truss where Sleetwater had doubled load on old pine. He remained conscious long enough to ask whether the mare in stall 3 had been pulled out. He died before sunrise while men with axes chopped at iced boards that would not lift in time. His death was the first named cost of Dry Creek's summer certainty. Reverend Amos Pike spent that same dawn moving between homes with a handbell, calling families toward the church as a gathering point because he believed Central Assembly would prevent panic and hoarding. The church stove had a cracked firebox from previous winter and could not sustain heavy draft under the blue norther. Amos crossed from the Parson Lane to the church porch with 2 blankets over his shoulder and no face wrap, and the wind cut through soaked wool faster than his lungs could clear ice-laden air. He reached the steps, fell against the rail, and was carried inside by 2 boys who found his pulse weak and slowing. He died at mid-morning from exposure while sleet struck the church glass like handfuls of gravel. By noon the same day, the town no longer argued about overreaction. Wind remained severe, roads vanished under crusted sleet, and temperature fell to a low of 14 degrees Fahrenheit before night. Freight sheds on Silas's north lot lost roof panels and one wall, spilling sacks, blankets, and men into open weather. Silas had concentrated labor crews and emergency goods in those sheds all season, so their failure displaced the largest cluster of exposed souls in 1 hour. That collapse resolved a practical obstacle in brutal fashion. Many who had refused Wayne's shelter now had no enclosed space left, and the wrecked sheds physically drove the first wave of refugees toward the only structure built for this exact event. The first knock came near dusk on October 10th, when Deputy Tom Bell arrived with Nina Red and 3 freight hands, carrying a boy with a crushed ankle from the shed collapse. Tom did not ask permission in formal language. He said, "We have injured and freezing souls. Can you take them?" Wayne pulled the door wide and answered, "Bring every soul you can move." Eli heard the same promise she had made beside Lark the night after council, and he turned at once to clear the entry turn for more bodies. That sentence set the town's survival tone. No tariff was posted, no ledger opened at the threshold, and no apology requested from the first arrivals. Eli took intake at the entry turn, counted names, assigned floor sections, and kept children nearest the stove wall where heat remained steadier. Tabea arrived before full dark with herb satchels wrapped in oilcloth and moved immediately to triage, setting splints, checking frostbite color, and brewing willow bark for fever and pain. Wayne rationed food by body size and exposure level, starting with broth from dried meat strips and beans softened in cellar water. then thickening portions as stove heat stabilized. Every action came from prior planning. The shelter's geometry mattered. Low ceiling volume, bermed walls, and offset entry reduced heat loss, enough to keep interior air survivable even with constant door traffic. Silas arrived at midnight, coat torn, face cut at the brow, carrying his account books under one arm as if habit had survived catastrophe. He halted in the entry when he recognized whose house he had entered. Wayne took the books from his hands, set them on a shelf, and directed him to wood-splitting duty beside men who had laughed on his porch in August. She gave him no speech. Work assignment replaced humiliation with necessity, and that choice prevented pride from delaying labor when labor meant heat for children. By morning on October 11th, the shelter held 80 souls and still absorbed arrivals. Eli and Tom Bell organized retrieval teams with rope lines from Stormhouse to church, then to two houses where families had signaled distress with lantern flashes through cracks in shutters. One team brought in the widow Mercer and her infant wrapped in a flour sack. Another brought 3 brothers from a dugout half filled with windblown ice. Every rescue consumed strength and wood. Wayne measured output hourly, adjusting stove burn and ration size so stores could extend through unknown duration. She cut adult portions first and never reduced children under 12 unless supply projections demanded it. On October 12th, the Blue Norther still held, sleet tapering to hard wind that scoured exposed ground and froze wagon ruts solid. The church became unusable after window failure on the west wall. Houses with high roofs and thin walls dropped below safe interior temperature by afternoon, unless families had unusual fuel reserves. Wayne's Stormhouse reached full function that day when intake reached 117 souls. She marked the number in Nina's ledger at dusk while Eli read names aloud to prevent double counting, and Tom Bell confirmed each household against his notebook, so no missing child remained unsearched. Food math governed every hour, from that point through October 20th. Wayne's 640 pounds of dried meat and 22 bushels of beans could not provide full peacetime meals for 117 souls over 10 days. So she shifted to emergency rations designed for warmth and continuity rather than comfort. Morning broth carried salt and rendered fat. Midday portions emphasized beans for sustained heat. Evening stew used thin meat strips, marrow from salvaged bones, and any wild onions or turnips retrieved in weather windows. Tabea supplemented with pine needle infusion for vitamin support and cough relief. Hunger remained present, yet starvation did not take hold. Water discipline proved as vital as food. 14 casks gave initial security, though crowd density and fever risk required strict handling. Wayne assigned 1 dipper per family cluster, boiled drinking water in rotation, and used melted sleet for washing to preserve cask reserves. Waste pits were dug leeward with canvas screens to protect dignity and reduce contamination. Tabea and Nina enforced cleanliness with stern consistency, washing hands between patients even when fingers cracked from cold. Before this storm, Dry Creek had treated hygiene as private preference. Inside the shelter, it became communal infrastructure. Night brought the hardest work. Coughing spread in close quarters. Children cried for separate beds that did not exist. Men accustomed to command slept shoulder to shoulder with laborers they had underpaid. Silas split wood until his palms opened and bled through cloth. Eli carried coal scuttle and ash bucket in an endless circuit between stove and trench. Wayne moved by lantern with a chalkboard listing fuel intervals, ration adjustments, and medical watch names, and no task received exemption for status. The frontier had suspended hierarchy and replaced it with competence under pressure. When weather eased enough on October 13th for longer retrieval runs, Wayne sent teams to recover stores from damaged homes and from Silas's partly collapsed freight sheds. She instructed each team to bring medicine, bedding, and infant supplies before luxury goods, and she posted item lists by household to prevent theft accusations from poisoning fragile trust. Tom Bell signed each salvage note. This administrative rigor resolved a new obstacle that disaster had created. Scarcity can fracture aid networks through suspicion. Transparent accounting kept cooperation intact while material loss was still fresh. By October the 15th, the town buried Cal Harlan and Reverend Amos Pike in frozen ground, cut with pick and fire. Funerals were brief and practical. Cal's sister placed his hat over the coffin lid before dirt fell. Amos's bell lay on a blanket by the grave because no one had strength to ring in Gale remnants. Wayne attended both burials after assigning Eli to stowewatch and Tabia to medical rounds. She stood with head uncovered in the cold and returned to shelter before speeches turned sentimental. Named deaths had already done their work. No rhetoric could increase their weight. The storm's immediate violence passed by October 12th, yet recovery remained a 10-day siege of cold, injury, and structural failure. From October 10th to October 20th, Wayne's house functioned as clinic, kitchen, dormitory, and council hall. Nina copied daily consumption into ledger margins beside names of households served. Eli cleared his debt schedule by proving labor value no freight contract could dispute. Silas saw this arithmetic in plain sight. His previous authority had depended on controlling access to work and goods. Inside Wayne's system, authority followed accurate preparation and fair distribution, which he had not provided when it mattered most. On October 20th, with roads partially open and homes patched enough for return, Wayne called each family by name and returned salvaged goods according to Tom Bell's sign lists. She kept no fee and requested no public praise. Silas approached her at the threshold, carrying a folded note that offered payment from freight profits for supplies consumed. Wayne accepted only replacement quantities in kind for the communal cellar she intended to build before next freeze, and she required labor days from every able household, including Silas's men as condition for participation. She rejected empty apology and selected enforceable practice instead. The first formal reckoning came 3 days later in the freight hall, where council had rejected her warning. Seats were filled by souls who had eaten her rations and slept under her roof. Silas rose first and spoke without ornament. He stated that his freight sheds had failed, his policy had failed, and Miss Wayne West's preparations had preserved 117 souls when standard methods had failed. He yielded chair authority for winter planning to Wayne and asked Deputy Tom Bell to draft enforceable ordinances for shared stores and low-profile construction standards. Public hierarchy moved in one audible shift. Wayne answered with measured terms that avoided triumph. She said she would teach methods to any household willing to work and record quantities, and she would not discuss personal insult from Summer because Winter did not negotiate with vanity. She set immediate tasks: one communal cellar near the church rise, one fuel trench behind the store, one inventory board updated weekly by Nina Red, and one weather watch rotation with Tabea advising on signs from plains and creek corridors. Her response turned moral emotion into institutions while grief remained recent enough to motivate labor. Deputy Tom Bell wrote the ordinances in plain language and enforced them through spring and autumn of 1875. Roof pitch limits were set for outbuildings exposed to northerly load. New homes required at least one insulated room with reduced window area on north walls. Every household contributed fixed portions to shared reserves at harvest, measured in bushels, cords, and preserved meat weight. Failure to contribute triggered labor penalties rather than fines, since cash scarcity made monetary punishment hollow. Bell's procedural caution, once mistaken for weakness, became a stabilizing force because he favored enforceable rules over grand declarations. Nina Red's ledgers became the town's memory. She copied Wayne's construction dimensions, ration tables, water handling rules, and salvage protocols into a bound volume stored in oilcloth at the general store. She titled one section, Cold Event Notes, October 1874, and beneath it she wrote names of the two dead, Cal Harlan and Reverend Amos Pike, with the conditions of death stated plainly. Her entries refused both gossip and erasure. Future arguments over whether the storm had truly required extraordinary preparation could be tested against records made in real time by witnesses who had no incentive to embellish. Eli West's ark closed in work rather than ceremony. Silas canceled the remaining $312 balance by signed release after Eli completed post-storm salvage leadership in spring-build labor, and Tom Bell witnessed the document. Eli moved from the freight bunkhouse to a room adjoining Wayne's stormhouse and spent summer teaching younger hands how to cut, stack, and cover fuel wood before first frost. Shame had hidden him for 2 years. Public, accountable labor restored his standing in one season because Dry Creek now valued the skills that had kept it alive. Tabea Nevaquia remained near Rain Crow Creek and traveled to Dry Creek on a fixed schedule through winter months. She co-led shelter drills with Wayne twice each season, one focused on intake and triage, the other on ration and sanitation discipline. Families who had once dismissed her signs as outsider lore now tracked antelope movement and pressure swings in notebooks beside crop yields. Knowledge transferred without ceremony because survival had already validated its source. Tabea accepted no honorary title from the council. She accepted practical commitments, medicine stores at agreed levels, and respect shown in labor rather than speech. Silas Redd did not become a different man overnight, and the town did not become uniformly virtuous. Trade still mattered. Profit still guided many choices, and status remained visible in land and stock counts. The key shift lay in domain boundaries. Dry Creek no longer treated commercial success as evidence of weather competence. When winter decisions arose, Wayne chaired and Tabea advised. While Silas supplied wagons and labor without claiming expertise he had not earned. This redistribution of authority made the settlement more durable than any single apology could have achieved. By late 1875, Wayne was called winter warden in everyday speech, first by children who needed a short title, later by adults who found the term precise. She accepted the role with one condition. Each household had to train at least one younger member in shelter procedure, so knowledge would not die with one generation. She and Eli hosted evening instruction in the 18 by 32 room that had once drawn laughter. They measured cord stacks, checked cask seals, and practiced carrying injured souls through the offset entry without blocking heat retention. Repetition turned emergency action into community habit. The legacy reached beyond one storm season because records and routines outlived memory's softening edges. In 1878, when another hard norther struck with less warning, Dry Creek moved 93 vulnerable souls into designated warm rooms across town within 6 hours and lost no one to exposure. Nina's ledger noted this in a short line beneath the old death entries, and Tom Bell signed the margin. Eli supervised fuel distribution from shared trenches. Tabea's early warning from Antelope Shift arrived 4 days ahead and triggered stock checks immediately. Wayne stood at the door counting arrivals as she had in 1874, and no laughter came from any porch. Travelers continued to call the region Comanche territory in camps and freight talk, even as maps shifted language and governance. Dry Creek learned to care less about names of jurisdiction and more about material truths of climate, wall thickness, reserve math, and cooperative labor under stress. That practical orientation was Wayne West's durable gift to a town that had once offered ridicule in exchange for warning. She had ridden 286 miles to retrieve one brother and found a failing civic system in the path of a known weather pattern. She repaired both through work that asked nothing from pride and demanded everything from discipline. Years later, old men who had stood on the porch with Cal told younger hands about the August evening when Wayne hammered staples through sod while the town laughed. Their versions varied in detail and softened their own cruelty, as stories often do when survivors narrate their past. Nina's ledger did not soften. It preserved quantities, dates, names, temperatures, and the count of 117 souls sheltered from October 10th to October 20th, 1874. Eli kept that book wrapped in oilcloth when the store roof was repaired, and Wayne required each new apprentice to read the entry on Cal and Amos before touching a shovel. When Wayne died decades later, long after Dry Creek had outgrown its first streets and added 2 more wells, the town placed no statue in the square and no sermon in her honor by demand of her written instructions. They did one thing in accord with her practice. They checked the communal stores before first freeze, measured wall seals, tested cask hoops, and updated the weather watch rotation with Tabea's successors and Eli's students signing in turn. The frontier kept its indifference. Dry Creek kept its preparation. Retribution had already passed through once, and the lesson remained where it belonged, in the hands of those willing to do the work.